diplomacy in The Hague. You can already ask
Excuse
the things
me.
you want to know.
Sorry.
Just
It
go
didn't
ahead.
work. Please start again.
Okay, no problem. Shall I start now?
Yes.
Okay, welcome to this interactive webinar of NGIZ Club Clingendael. Good to have you here. The main question today is, how does diplomacy work in The Hague? So we won't go into specific content of the talks that diplomats and ambassadors might have, but we want to know the dynamics of their work, the fora and the tools they use to have good international relationships. But most of all, we follow the line you draw, because you can ask the questions you have in the chat box. I hope it's here, otherwise it's there. It's in either way right next to this video. My name is Jos Hummelen. I'm the chair of NGIZ Club Clingendael and the host for today. We are completely run by volunteers, so if you like what we do, just leave a comment somewhere on Facebook, LinkedIn, wherever. Thank you for watching, and thank you for asking whatever is on your mind on this topic, diplomacy in The Hague. Our last webinar was about China. You can still find that on YouTube, and you can find this webinar on YouTube too. So let's start with today's main theme, diplomacy in The Hague. So in the Netherlands, you can already ask what you want to ask, and I will use the questions you ask to ask on the experts for today. Marcel Wolters of NGIZ Club Clingendael will introduce this topic briefly, and of course, both the speakers we have. So go ahead, Marcel.
Yes, thanks, Jos Hummelen, and of course, the speakers for joining us. We will discuss the topic of public affairs as a recent term, and the ancient art, I would almost call it, of diplomacy, which is also an interesting theme, given the fact that we're very closely related, for example, to the Institute Clingendael, which is, does a lot of research in this matter and is very much based upon the world of diplomacy. What is diplomacy? That's the main question, of course. As has been read and said before, it is an established method of influencing decisions and behaviors of foreign governments and of people through dialogue, negotiation, and other measures. Short of war, or differently put, that's something you will want to steer away from, and that's historically what diplomacy was used for. Mostly in the early stages of diplomacy, especially in the First World War period, with the Triple Entente, what is now called old diplomacy, meant that the communication between the countries involved are bilateral, somewhat narrow, elite, private. That's the words that were used for the old world of diplomacy. And with the start of the UN, many have seen that there was a shift towards a more open, multilateral, and transparent communication between countries. And that evolved into what we today call public affairs, which is a wider term connected to diplomacy. This explanation is, of course, the base upon of why we have this session today, and we want to dive deeper into what is diplomacy and what is the environment of behind the stages politics, let's say. To discuss this, we want to welcome Naor Gilon, the ambassador of Israel in the Netherlands, in The Hague, who has an impressive list of career list, let's say. Started studying in Tel Aviv for political sciences, finished his master's summa cum laude at the Corvinus University in Budapest, and went on to have a lot of impressive functions in the world of diplomacy. as the chief of mission of embassy of Israel in Hungary, and started off towards the being the advisor for 3 Israeli prime ministers. Went on to become also involved in at the head of the Bureau of International Affairs at the Center of Policy Research, Chief of Staff of Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and before becoming the ambassador of the Netherlands, he was also the ambassador of Italy, San Marino. So thank you, Naor, Gilon, for joining us to talk about diplomacy. The second guest is Paul Meerts, who is a well-known face to us, to NGIZ, and of course also Clingendael. He was the Deputy General Director at Clingendael, and is also known for the PhD that he finished on diplomatic negotiation. Well, with what other people could you discuss this topic better, of course, than with these 2 people, as I just explained. So I want to give the word to Jos to talk to the guests and to discuss what is diplomacy.
Yeah, thanks, Marcel, and thank you for tuning in if you decided to come a little bit later. Thanks for being here with us. Get more out of it by asking what you want in the chat box. My colleague will send me the on-topic questions. The off-topic questions maybe can be answered via the chat box itself. We are talking about what an ambassador does and how diplomacy and public diplomacy works. You can also ask questions anonymous. You can send me a WhatsApp. The number will be appearing in the chat box shortly. The number is 06 or 00316 424 96779. But you can also ask the question in the chat box, of course. And if you want to get involved, go to menti.com and type in the following code. It's 359524. We'll ask you 2 questions, but come back to that later. So that's menti.com, and it's 359524. But I'll hope my colleague will drop that in the chat box as well. So we are starting with diplomacy in general, and at the end of the webinar, we'll look towards the difficulties of the job and some current affairs. We won't go deep into specific kinds of subject because that's not where this webinar is for. But I would like to be as specific as possible and try to really get a grip on this exciting topic. So I want to start with Mr. Gilon. You've worked all over the world, as Marcel said, and you are quite new in The Hague. What is specific about diplomacy in The Hague?
Yeah, so there are 2 kinds of diplomacy. There's bilateral diplomacy and multilateral. Bilateral are ambassadors who are just serving the country. Here in The Hague, like I had in Rome before, I had the dual job. Most of the more medium-sized embassies and down in The Hague, they really do both tasks. They are the ambassadors to the Netherlands, are in charge of building the relations between their country and the Netherlands in all aspects. And the multilateral part of the work, which is totally different. It's a different kind of diplomacy and work, which here is mainly OPCW, the Chemical Weapon Organization, the Chemical Weapon Anti-Chemical Weapon.
Yeah,
and the other.
That was close already. A slip of the tongue there.
Yeah, and the rest and the others are mostly connected to the international legal institutions that are located here. So the most famous ones are, of course, ICC and ICJ, but there are many. There are much more than those 2. So you deal in parallel with both things, and both have different codes and different work. By the way, for an Israeli ambassador, it's even different because our situation, always international organizations, is more unique, but we can speak about it later if people are interested.
Mr. Meerts, these organizations are based in The Hague. The Hague likes to say that they're the city of peace, of course. How important are these places also for diplomats and ambassadors? How important is The Hague on a global scale?
Well, The Hague would love to be very important, but I'm afraid it's not so important actually. They say, well, we are the capital of peace and justice in the world. So because of the courts, etc., etc. But yeah, we are there after New York, after Geneva, after Vienna, and then it's The Hague. Especially the former mayor, Deetman, who tried to put The Hague much more on the map. And more or less, he has been successful also because of OPCW, etc. But still, we shouldn't overestimate ourselves, I think.
But Mr. Meerts, let's dive into how diplomacy works. What does it take to be a good ambassador, in your opinion?
Well, we have a good example here, the ambassador of Israel.
Yeah, you think he's a good ambassador? Yeah, why is that?
Why is that? Because if you are from a country like Israel, which is in itself is in a difficult position ever since from 1948 onwards, and you really have to public diplomacy is extremely important. And how to do that with so many conflicts and problems with the Palestinians, but also, how do we look at Mr. Netanyahu, etc. And then as an ambassador, to find a balance, to convince the people that the state of Israel is there, should be there, etc. But still, some things will have to be changed. That I think is quite a difficult task. You really need a good diplomat. And what we see is, as far as I know, that the Israeli ambassadors we had in the Netherlands till now, including the ambassador in front of you, have all been people who had a very important role in the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then they came to the Netherlands, because I think for Israel, the Netherlands is still quite a special place. And it's quite an important post, although we are a very small country, but for Israel, it's quite an important post, I feel.
Mr. Gilon, how important is public diplomacy really in your line of work?
Public diplomacy is extremely important. I think this is maybe the place to touch how the role of the ambassador has changed over the years. In the past, when communications were very poor, ambassadors, by the way, were very rich people usually, who were merchants, so they had interest. They were sent overseas. Some of them could declare war, because the meaning of being able to have all the toolbox of the time, if you were the British ambassador to God knows where, that it takes you by ship 2 months to get, or a month, 45 days to get there, think of it, that there is a problem, he wants to declare war. So he has to send a request to the king, or let's say his king or whatever. They have to send it back. So 3 months have passed, and
that's too long. So they had to decide instantly.
They had the powers to do it. They were self-sustained economically. So that was at that time. They were very important. Now we live in a global world where most prime ministers, let's say in Europe, probably have the WhatsApp of each other. So they don't need the ambassador to declare war. I'm joking. They don't need the ambassador to talk directly among them. So diplomacy has changed. And you, as diplomats in general, ambassadors too, have to find how they can be relevant. So it's very in the world today to deal with economy. Because why? Because when you go to the Ministry of Finance, who pays or gives you the budget and pays your salary, you can tell them it's cost benefit effective, because you give me $1 billion a year as a budget, but I bring, through improving of economic ties, I bring 2 billion back. So every euro you put into me, you get 2 back. For example, that's part of the reasoning. So diplomacy has changed tremendously. Now, I think that also we all understand that the traditional press is down. The written press, everything, but also the internet press, the traditional one. And we see alternative ones. So if you want to be relevant, public diplomacy, and especially for Israel, as was said here before, we are fighting for our legitimacy, for our image, for our survivability. It's not a regular case of a country. So today, public diplomacy, for me, is a huge part of my work. And I understand today that through social networks, I can reach as many people without having any favors or any people on the way, or any journalist on the way to make my life hard with questions like webinars, or to write it in a way that fits his views or wishes, you know, to distort. So it's a very different world. I think public diplomacy is extremely important and it gives you a lot of power. You can speak to people.
So let's say 50 years ago, you would concentrate more on the elites in policy making, and now you want to communicate directly with the people in a certain country. Is that right?
It's partially, because still the elites are very, very important. The people who do the movers and shakers are still the people, the elites. Elites in different. It can be politicians. Elite, they're not necessarily rich or
no.
But they are the people who decide in parliament, for example. If you want to have something in parliament or in a ministry, you have to approach these people. But you can also do things bottom up. You can go to the public, create pressure on the politicians by their supporters, people they care about, their voters. And then the politicians, if they don't listen to you, they would listen to their own voters or supporters. So, you know, it's a mix of the two.
Yeah. Is that also why you said yes to this webinar, so that people can see your face, and by seeing your face and talking to you, they have a certain image of Israel, and that hopefully gets better?
First of all, I thought that the webinar is interesting, and I got compliments in the beginning that I'm a good diplomat. So I'm already, I made in the first 5 minutes, I already made my salary. But in general, yes, I think that it's important at the end of the day. You know, we live in a world of images. If you don't like the leader of a country, you don't like the country many times. If you don't like the diplomat of the country, you don't like the country. So the diplomat has to be an acceptable, I don't want to say likable, it's a strong word, but he has to be acceptable by the viewer. So at least that the viewer is ready to listen to what he has to say. I mean, on the real issues. We are not touching now the issues of the conflict or Iran or those issues. We're not going into it. But in general, if you don't like the messenger, you don't care about the message. So you better be a likable or acceptable messenger, so your message will be well heard by people in general.
Yeah. So
may I add something to that?
Yeah, yes, you may. Please.
It's very interesting. For example, Prodi, who was the president of the commission, said in an interview, he said, as a professor in Italy of political science and history, I never believed the history books that the leaders and the character of the leaders and the chemistry between the leaders had such an impact on the outcome of the negotiations between them. But my experience in Europe has been that this is tremendously important. It has a huge impact. Are you talking with Tony Blair, or are you talking with President Chirac, or are you talking with Mr. Berlusconi? The differences between the leaders have a huge impact on outcomes and politics. Well, we see that now more or less with Mr. Erdogan, for example. But the role of the diplomat changed, but I think the importance of the diplomat didn't change. And may I just give one anecdote about the Middle East? And it's a long time ago, but I think it's still relevant. At a certain moment during the Crusades, Richard the Lionheart was in the Holy Land on the coast, and he wanted to conquer Jerusalem. But the problem was, in between him and Jerusalem was Saladin, the famous Kurdish Sultan. And so Richard the Lionheart thought, you know, I can fight with him, but before I do that, I need information about him and the strength of his army. So he sent an envoy to Saladin. And the envoy said to Saladin, my master, Richard the Lionheart, wants to negotiate with you. And the answer of Saladin was, kings don't negotiate unless an agreement has been reached. In other words, we first do this through diplomats. And then if the diplomats have more or less a deal, then the leaders come in and they might finalize the deal. And that again, I think shows the importance of the role of the diplomat in between two kings or two leaders or whatever.
Yeah, and I don't know which crusade this was exactly, but one of the crusades was stopped by the gates of Jerusalem through diplomacy also. So without getting too much into the history, but Mr. Gilon, is that the strength of diplomacy to avoid war and boycotts?
Well, I will disappoint you. Of course, diplomacy has a lot of roles. I can tell you how we see diplomacy, for example. So, of course, diplomacy, and by the way, not only diplomats do diplomacy. We have to understand that militaries, they have diplomats. They call them officers, but their job, they are not regular officers. These are officers who do international relations, and they go to speak to officers from other militaries.
Now, we know it by the American example. They always talk about the hearts and the minds, winning the hearts and the minds of the people in Afghanistan since Vietnam.
But also between chief of staffs. One chief of staff goes to another chief of staff. They discuss. So there is diplomacy between secret services. A lot of the work that Israel was doing in countries where Muslim countries where we didn't have diplomatic relations was done by the Mossad, the Israeli services. It was not done it was done secretly because these countries would risk, if it would come out to the daylight, it can risk the connection. So they wanted secrecy because it could be a little bit counterproductive to make it public in their publics and stuff. So diplomacy is not only diplomats, it can be other people. It's a way of conducting yourself. So yeah, in general, diplomacy is a way to solve, I don't know if it's wars, it's to solve issues. Negotiations of Israel to release Gilad Shalit, the soldier that was captured, was kidnapped into Gaza. So it was diplomacy. And by the way, part of it was done by diplomats, part of it by former Mossad, part of it by other people from secret services. So it's a sort of solve the problem in a quiet way. And this is, I think, and it also goes to wars, but it's more complicated than that, I think.
Yeah. A question from our viewers who want to be diplomats. What type of person makes a good diplomat, Mr. Meerts? What do you have to have?
Well, I think you have to understand that although you have a difficult message, although you don't like the other person or whatever, that you still have to be able to talk to the other person. Because if you don't talk, there will be no process. If there's no process, there's either nothing or there might be war. So that's very important, that you're able to talk to people you might not like or whatever. Also that you understand that maybe you have a certain opinion, but the opinion of your government is different. So you have to, you're an agent as a diplomat, so you're representing your country. You have to understand that sometimes you have to defend certain positions that maybe you don't like. But it is important. And what you try to do is to move the whole thing in a certain direction that's favorable to your country. But then you can only do that if you have empathy for the other person. If you don't have empathy for the problem of the one or the other side of the table, it will be very, very difficult to come to a certain solution, what the Americans call win-win, although Mr. Trump probably would define win-win as I want to win.
Somehow
twice,
Trump is in every webinar twice. So far. I don't know how he does it, but
well, I don't know either. But I'm not Mr. Trump. But it is important then to have empathy for the other party. Some business people, CEOs say, if you're negotiating with another party, you should not have empathy because then you will give in too much. But I think in diplomacy, it's absolutely vital to have empathy for the other side. But empathy is not sympathy.
Okay, let's make it as practical as we can. I got a question here. Where do lobbyists and diplomats meet? Can we see you, for example, Mr. Gilon, drinking in a main square in The Hague, a cup of coffee?
Yeah, it depends really on. It depends really on the type, how sensitive is the meeting. Sometimes there are meetings in New York when I served in the UN. I used to have meetings with countries who had shared interests with us, but not diplomatic relations. Naturally, these meetings took places took place in places where we were less likely to meet other diplomats or other people. So,
for example, in embassies or
No. Usually because there are countries we don't have relations with security-wise, I would not be the most popular person if I bring them to my embassy or if I decide to enter their embassy. So, I was...
neutral ground, but where?
Yeah, so we used to go to, in New York, you will see the diplomats, the UN is on the 42nd Street, around 42nd, 43rd Street on First Avenue. So most diplomats go between 38th Street on 2nd Avenue to where the restaurants are, to like 55. If you go down to 20th Street on 2nd Avenue, you will see no one. The chances you will see someone. So we used to take restaurants for lunches, for example, which are far away, and the chances to meet anyone would see us together and make the connection would be very, very slim. So it can be, but usually it can be wherever it's convenient. It can be in offices, it can be in cafes. The atmosphere usually in an office is more intimate in the sense that intimate in the way you can exchange information. And there is a lot of exchange of information in diplomacy, and it's more friendly in a bar, in a cafe, in a restaurant, in a place where you feel, it's leisure, we are enjoying life, we are doing good stuff. So it really depends on the character. What are the relations with the person? Because you have to.
How easy is it for you to maneuver security-wise?
I'm not supposed to speak on my security. I'm well in a well situation. I'm well guarded. So I mean, in this situation, I'm okay. I'm okay with. Unfortunately, I have to be, but I'm okay. I'm not limited, so I do whatever I need to do. It's not.
Yeah. And what influence does an embassy have on the political policy in The Hague, Mr. Gilon?
So we are speaking on the bilateral, you asked, or on the multilateral?
Bilateral.
Bilateral, at the end of the day, parliaments in all the world are working according to the same principles in different ways. Yeah, the principles are the same. So you have to understand what makes the parliament tick. How do you, in the Netherlands, I learned a system that I did not know in any other place, that the foreign affairs spokespersons of the different parties, these are the people who decide, not the head of the parties. So it's a thing you understand. Once you understand that, you have to understand who can be an ally for you on things that you need or block things that you don't want to happen.
And the timing is very important because things are decided way before they are decided in the north.
But luckily in this country it's a consensus system, at least within the coalition. Let's agree. So once the coalition goes in to work on a topic, usually you will know something is happening. You will hear it here or there on Twitter. Today everyone exposes everything they do because it's part of promoting yourself also, your work, I mean. So you would learn it from friends or from others, and you can usually be involved. Sometimes you would be surprised and get a fait accompli. It also happens, but at least in our case, we have enough friends, I think, in the political system in the Netherlands, that we are hardly surprised. Sometimes we are disappointed from outcomes. I'm not saying that, but at least we are not surprised, which is another element, by the way, because a diplomat, an ambassador, who is surprised, it's not seen very positively in his capital.
Yeah, but do you, for example, talk with Mr. Blok from Foreign Affairs? Is that
when needed? Yeah, I had a couple of meetings with the Foreign Minister Blok, with Sigrid Kaag, the Foreign Affairs. So I don't see people. Minister of Foreign Affairs is something else. I think every ambassador should have a first meeting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the country where it's serving, because this is the highest professional level you're supposed to meet.
Is that the first thing you did when you went to the Netherlands?
No, one of the first meetings. It takes time until you organize it. But yeah, I think it was probably in the first month, 5-6 weeks maybe. I don't remember exactly. But I think you have to see him. But then you ask who is a good diplomat. I was dealing with accepting people into the diplomatic service. I think one of the most, you have to have a very, I wanted to say people's person, but then I said, no, it's not the right definition. You have to have a good perception of people and situations, because at the end of the day, you have to be in a situation where you don't tire the other side. If you go to a meeting with a high level like Minister Blok, first time they will accept you because it's a courtesy, they want to know you, a new ambassador. You better not come the second time if it's not an important issue that you want to raise, and is also the other side, either it's very important to your country and they want you to do that, or you think it's useful for the minister or for the person you're going to meet, for him. Because if you're starting to tire high-level people who are very busy with useless meetings, they will be fed up with you. So this is part of the having a perception, is to understand the situation where you are. What is, one of the most important things, understand what makes the person in front of you. Diplomacy is the relations between people. It's between countries, but it's going down to the two people or more people who are representing their countries. And
that's a thing I take already from this webinar, that it's so bizarre actually that relations between countries can be defined by the persons who represent the country. Hey, we're halfway. We ask you to go to menti.com if you are viewing with the code 359524. Let's look at the results in a second. Let me first ask Mr. Gilon, what do you expect the crowd will answer to the question of what they appreciate most in a foreign ambassador in The Hague? Is that A, honesty? Is that B, knowledge of the Dutch culture and history? C, clear explanation of foreign policies? Or D, relationship with Dutch politicians and policy makers? What do you think? So A, honesty, B, knowledge of the Dutch culture and history, C, a clear explanation of foreign policies, or D, relationship with Dutch politicians and policy makers?
I would have loved, I see myself as a direct and honest person, so I would go for A, because this is what, you always reflect on what you think that you are. So it doesn't mean that people think the same as me, so I would never.
Can you see my screen now?
I see. Honesty 1, I'm very surprised, by the way. I'm happy. I'm happy. It's a good
knowledge
thing,
of the Dutch culture and history came in second.
Yeah, you always have to know. One of my shortcomings, by the way, is that I don't speak Dutch. It's the first country I serve in that I don't speak the language, but it's I'm becoming older. It's becoming harder, and you speak such a good English, so I always find who to blame. As a good diplomat, so blame the people. You speak your English is still good. Cost effective is not worthwhile learning. So.
Yeah, people are still voting, by the way. So you see a little bit
stop
of
it
change.
Now, because honesty is number one. It will change if you continue. You should stop it. It's I will lose the bet.
I'll go to the second question. Let me see if that works here. Yeah. So, to what extent do you agree? Let's go to the first one, Mr. Gilon. The most important skill of an ambassador is keeping his or her head cool at all times. Do you strongly agree or strongly disagree? It's in between 1 and 5. What would you say? And people can also answer.
Yeah, I can see now. I can see it's a 4, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, I would agree with the 4, by the way. I think, and again, it's always good to think straight in life in general, by the way. It's a good, not only diplomacy. It's always good because when you are mad, as they say, if you are really mad, take 10 seconds before you answer. Not to answer under the emotions, but under the rationale. So it's important.
Yeah. Are there ambassadors that you know of that are rather emotional and use that as well?
Of course, I met many emotional ambassadors. I'm an emotional ambassador, I must say. To be an ambassador of Israel, it's something else. You have to be very passionate about it. It's not an easy thing, especially in international organizations. I was in the UN, and you see the hypocrisy. It makes you so I was always emotional. But it's important. It's good. It's good to be emotional in life. But again, this goes back for the first one.
We asked the ambassador of Guatemala to be here as well. Do you think his job is easier in that way? Because if he goes to the UN, not everybody has a strong opinion about Guatemala, but everybody has a strong opinion about Israel.
Yeah, in the UN, it's even worse. It's a strong opinion. Of course, his job is easier. And we don't belong to any geographical group. We are like, we are alone there. We are not part of the European group. We are part of WIOG. It's a complicated explanation. I'm not going to it, but really, We are not part of the European. We are not part of the Muslim or Arab group, as we call it. We are not part of Asia in different forms. Yeah, we are not part of South America. We're not part of Africa. So we are really one voice, very small country, half the size of the Netherlands. It can be very frustrating, you know, at times. But
you partner up since you are sort of out of a strict group. You have Israel has a complex relationship with Europe, of course. But you can partner up with, let's say, Germany, and you can partner up with Ethiopia, for example.
Yeah, but you know, when groups, usually big groups, they vote according to the interest of the group. So you are, you know, and let's say about voting on positions in the UN system, okay, in the Security Council. They will go and vote because there is a turn within the African group, for example, and they decide that this term it will be Gambia, next term it will be Nigeria. So the whole group, regardless of whether they think that Israel maybe is a better candidate than one of them for the job of Security Council, they will not vote according to substance. They will vote according to the decision of the group of how to make sure that the representation of the group is maintained in an orderly way. So I took a technical vote because it's very easy, but on substance it's the same.
Let's go to the second one. The ultimate success of diplomacy is an ongoing dialogue. Many people strongly agree. Do you?
Dialogue is, of course, important.
Would you say 5?
By the way, yeah, it's in the middle there. Dialogue is important. I will tell you that the power, using military power, that, you know, in Europe, in a pacifistic continent since Second World War, more or less, if Yugoslavia is not considered here, and not Europe at the time, at least.
And not Ukraine now?
Yeah, but again, it's something it's not internal, you know, it's not internal, it's something from Russia. It's more complicated, I think.
Yeah.
But in general, also using weapon and power is part of diplomacy. Because if you want to push someone, to put pressure on him to do something, it can be economic sanctions, economic power, like the Americans are using against Iran now, for example. It can be military pressure to push them into negotiations, because military pressure can be to conquer a territory, but it can be also to threaten someone to do what you want him to do.
Yeah, I've been in the Golan Heights last summer, and what I've learned is that I don't know if you agree. They said in the Middle East is first you shoot and then you talk. Do you agree?
But the joke about the Middle East, that if you are invited to a dinner, make sure that you're not part of the menu. The Middle East is an interesting place. It's a place that cherishes power of leadership. Most of the leaderships in our region are not democratic. Why? You can say because many things, but I think because also people want a powerful leader.
Yeah.
So, you know, there are countries who are looking for that, and power speaks in the Middle East, no doubt about it.
Mr. Meers, thirdly, the ultimate failure of diplomacy is a boycott or even a war. Do you agree?
No, it can be part of diplomacy. And it was interesting.
But is it ultimate failure? What is ultimate failure then, if it's not a war?
I think First World War is an example of ultimate failure of diplomacy. First World War could have been avoided, and thereby also probably the Second World War. Diplomacy failed completely. I think that speaks for itself. It was interesting what the ambassador said about the menu. Recently, British diplomat said he didn't like Brexit at all because you have to be at the table in Brussels, and if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And indeed, we don't want to be on the menu. And then you have to be there. Then you have to be at the table. You have to try to continue the dialogue. And although you might say that even diplomatic negotiations sometimes can be defined as war by peaceful means, because it can be very, very, very tough, and it can be very, very harsh, still it is peaceful means. And in that sense, diplomacy is also seen as a tool, sometimes a tool in warfare. The French were the ones who, for the first time, really analyzed diplomacy. long time ago, long before the Americans wrote books about it, because they saw diplomacy as supportive to the role of the army of France. And of course, the role of the army was important because France wanted to be a powerful country in Europe. So diplomacy has different roles.
I want to add, I agree with you, by the way, on the example. The 6-Day War is another very good example in Israel. Many people feel that Otan, that the Secretary General of the UN, was one of the main reasons for that war that could have been avoided, because he did not play the game in a smart way. It's a long thing, I will not go into it, but in general, diplomacy fails from time to time, but it's still needed even after it failed, because all the wars are ended by diplomacy at the end. Unless it's total surrender, it's very, in our modern world, we rarely have a total surrender war. So you have to have diplomacy to have a ceasefire. You have to have a diplomacy to exchange prisoners afterwards of war. You have to arrange the life after the war. So diplomacy is ongoing. So it has the downsides, upsides, it goes up, it goes down. It's like the stock exchange in the United States now, but it's, it's complex, but it goes on. It goes on.
I got a question here, Mr. Gilon. How do you deal with strong anti-Israel sentiment? I think he's not even talking about anti-Semitism. I think he's rather talking about negative emotions people might have just when you say you represent the state of Israel.
I will tell you that in the two ambassadorial missions that I have done so far, both in Italy and here, very, very rarely did people come to me in a discussion of people. Politicians I had, you take a very extreme left politician, anti-Israel, the discussion between us will not be nice. And, as I tell you, I'm very adaptive. I can be very nice to people who are nice and I feel comfortable with them, and I can be very unnice to people who are very unnice to me. So, one of the biggest problems is that my knowledge of the Middle East is very high because I grew up there and I lived there, and I felt I was a soldier like everyone else, an officer in the Israeli military, and I know a lot about it. I studied Arabic. And sometimes you come to people and it frustrates you, it drives you crazy that they are not speaking at the same level. They're speaking a very shallow level. They don't know the facts. They don't know the history. They think they know because they heard something somewhere, someone saying, and it's very hard. There is a lot. I want to say, usually you shouldn't do that, but I will go to speak about Sigrid Kach. Many of the Israeli supporters think that Sigrid Kach, the fact that her husband is a Palestinian, speaks Arabic, and she worked in UNRWA and other Lebanon, other organizations, she's anti-Israel. And I met with her a few times. She was in my home a couple of times. I really enjoyed speaking to her. It's not that we agree on everything, but at least we speak at the same level of knowledge. So, we can agree or disagree, but we are speaking eye to eye. Sometimes you speak to people that it frustrates you, that they know nothing, and they speak as if they know everything.
Or they know just one perspective, for example.
No, usually it's like, if you know everything, it's okay, I respect you. I respect the discussion. We don't have to agree. But rarely was I confronted in a way with regular people that I met who came to me and said, your country is, no, you don't see that. You have a civilized discussions as you have between two people. You can agree or you can agree to disagree. But it's a discussion, it's good. Dialogue is good.
Yeah. And what do you think? I'm curious, because I got a question here. What is the Dutch public opinion about Israel, and how does it influence your job? Can you say something about that in general remarks?
Yeah, no, I would be happy to say. I was born, I'm 56. I was born, I'm doing the math for you already, so you don't try to, now everyone will work on this. So I was born in 1964. And 1974 was the Mondial where you lost to Germany at the end with Johan Cruyff and all the team, 2-1. This was a time in the 70s and 60s, 70s, and probably these were the times that were the peak of the relations. I think the Netherlands was considered in Israel as the biggest friend of Israel. I remember myself as a 10-year-old crying when the Netherlands lost to Germany at the finals. And after the 73 war, there was the oil boycott on many countries where the Netherlands refused to surrender. I don't know if the younger people here know, but Dutch people had to to leave their car at home a couple of times a week in order to avail. There wasn't enough energy because the Netherlands was not cooperating with the Arab oil boycott. Today, things have changed, but this was also the time that Israel was a very, a very interesting socialist country with the kibbutz as a model, and many Dutch went to volunteer. By the way, you can find their partners here. So, you can find here many Israelis who got married in the 60s, 70s. They're already a little bit older, married to a Dutch partner, and they're here. There are almost 10,000 Israelis, some of them from that era, some of them different eras. But anyhow, today, with the time, relations evolved, and today I would say that there are more normal, I'm not happy about it, more normal relations as we have with the positive European country. So it's very, not Germany, but very close to what we have with Germany, I think. With Germany, there is another element of the Holocaust, which is very strong and basic and present in all what we do with Germany.
Yeah, I got a really good question from EM. These are probably initials. Considering the recent events in the West Bank, or the non-events in the West Bank, which has received a lot of international attention, how have you experienced the last month in a diplomatic sense?
When I was younger, I used to get more agitated maybe from things, but when you become more experienced, 30 years a diplomat, you become more experienced, you already understand to take things in perspective. So yeah, the issue of the so-called annexation, so-called because I will not go into we promised not to go into the topics, was a burning issue for a while. Some of my team were very nervous, and I told them, we live in a world where patience of interest in the topic dies alone after, in the worst case scenario, after 2 weeks. So, it was an issue. We had to deal. We had to do a lot of talking to people, explaining the real situation. And now no one talks about it.
No, but isn't that a problem? Because now people think that a lot of the West Bank is actually annexed because there was this opportunity and everybody was talking about the first steps towards war, but nobody talks about it now. Isn't that a loss?
No, maybe I'm always look at the full half of the glass. So when we do decide to do this, go forward with annexation, people will not be already upset because the Israelis already no, I'm joking, already annexed according to you. No, it's part of, people think this, and that's what I'm saying, that the part of our biggest enemy, by the way, as an Israeli diplomat, is ignorance to the facts. So, because again, as I said before, if people have the facts, they can take, I don't care if they take a negative, I care, but I accept the fact that they can take a negative approach towards Israel and its policies. But if people are not aware and they take a negative, this really bothers me because there is no chance I can persuade them because the facts are not in front of them. So it's a complicated thing. But with, when you get older and you're more experienced, you are less, you understand that what seems to you like a mountain now, a huge mountain, is just a small hill because there are so many hills in life, and in career, in the nations, in the world, that you all the time you go up and down, just maintain. Arik Sharon, our late prime minister, used to say about politics. It's interesting. It's like it reminds me of this. He used to say that it's like a giant fair wheel in the park, amusement park. Politics is like that. As a politician, you always have to be on the wheel. Sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down, but be sure not to get off the wheel. So I think this is life. You have ups and you have downs, but try to make it.
And you're getting nowhere. No kidding.
Yeah, this is on the treadmill.
I'm speeding it up a little bit. I got a good question from Timo Balser. Do diplomats still have to be in a certain country to exercise public diplomacy? He's actually asking, why are you even here?
Okay, maybe you answered yourself, I think, when you did this poll and people said how important it is to understand the culture. You gave the answer. So yeah, you can be in Israel and do the Facebook of the embassy here in the Netherlands. Do you understand the Dutch people? Do you really understand? I mean, even if you speak the language, do you know what's happening here? Mm-hmm. Can you now have the same Facebook to the Netherlands and even to Germany, not to speak of Pakistan? So, each country has its own things that make. We are trying to do, by the way, a lot of soft diplomacy. What is soft diplomacy? If we go to people and start speaking to them about the Israeli-Arab conflict or about Iran all day long, we are going to bore them to death. People have no interest in this stuff. It doesn't. Most people, or there are people who are. But if you speak to people about what interests them and is common with you, this is already relevant. So if young people here love football and you speak about football in Israel, they can relate to it sometimes. At the end, it's people. If you speak to them, you have to understand who you speak to. So you can do it from far away, but you will not be effective as you are when you live in the country. And
great answer. Yeah, I think I understand. Mr. Meerts, a question from Jelle Bakker. Is military power part of diplomacy, or is military pressure the failure of diplomacy? We have been into this a little bit, but he's still asking the question. Can you answer?
Diplomacy can be an instrument of the military. The military can be an instrument of diplomacy. It depends on the situation. If diplomacy is anything, it's situational.
Okay. Question of Michael Stam. Who inspired you to get interested in diplomacy, or what diplomat or leader do you look up to? For Mr. Meerts and later for Mr. Gilon, maybe.
I'm not looking up to any leader, I'm afraid, but it's maybe typically Dutch. My interest in it because
no, but maybe Kissinger or
no, thank you. No, in the end, no, not so much. Well, a very good diplomat. Well, there was a very good French diplomat a long time ago, and he was the one who saved France after the defeat of Napoleon. And he got France a bit bigger than it was before the revolution after the Vienna Conference. And that is the good diplomat. That is the real diplomat. And that was amazing. For the rest, there's not so much to add to it, I'm afraid. What I found
Mr. Gilon, why did you go into diplomacy?
Yeah, you really want to hear it? Will be funny. No, because a friend of mine, I studied political science because I didn't know what I want to do. And a friend of mine who studied with me said, let's go to cadets course. I must confess, I had an uncle who was a diplomat, ambassador at the time, but I had it was not a, so he said, let's go. I told him, you're crazy. We go now. There are 1,500 applicants, and like 15 people are accepted, 10 to 15 people. I had no chance. So we went, I passed, it's a long test, and he failed, but he did it a year after he joined me. So it was by coincidence, by not knowing what I want to do. I'm very happy of the career. I think it's for people who like moving, not doing the same stuff for a long time. This is very important. You know, in Kissinger, I have to say it tells a lot about diplomacy. Kissinger was a master diplomat, by the way, born in Germany. He was the best friend of my uncle. My father's older brother, they were born in the same place in Germany. And but Kissinger, there is a say about him that everyone, very funny, because he said someone came to him with a good argument. He said, "This argument is excellent. It has the added value of being the truth." So I think this is telling a lot about Kissinger's philosophy. If I would go to a leader that I would go to Ben-Gurion, because Ben-Gurion was really, I think, a magician, because he's the prime minister who started he took people who came Jews who came from all around the world, from different mentalities and cultures, from the Arab world, Muslim world, from Europe, from the Far East, from Latin America. And he had the task of taking all these people together in a very, very poor country, absorbing them, creating a country, fighting, because they were in a fight. Jews cannot have unanimity ever. So in a fight, outside enemies, with all that, he built the country. And the pressures he had, and many of the things that he did were amazing. He made some mistakes that we pay until today of certain things, but he was a great leader, really.
Question of Julia Berg. Do you experts have any tips on networking for young professionals and how to gain access to the diplomatic world in such a highly competitive time? Great question to end with, I think.
Well, if I will take the floor on this. I think that, first of all, we live in a world, because of the social networks, and all good ambassadors and diplomats must have a profile on social networks. If they're not there, they're not existing in the world. And then you have, it depends, LinkedIn, for example, is considered more of a professional type of social network. I get questions. It depends on the ambassador or the diplomat, how cooperative it is. But I get questions from people on, on the messenger of Facebook, on Twitter, on everything, on LinkedIn, of people who ask me questions or approach me. And I think unless they are really abusive, which is rare, I try to communicate. As I said, I communicate with everyone who wants to really communicate. It doesn't care. I don't care about the person. When I have the time, I sit down and I answer. And I think
so. You're actually inviting Julia to write you a message on, let's say, LinkedIn.
First of all, yes. But in general, I'm inviting Julia to write messages to people who interest her and start a discussion with them. But it has to be a serious discussion with substance. Don't come to people who are busy people, as I said before, and excuse my English, don't bullshit them. So, don't start. If you have something interesting to ask them, relevant for you, relevant for them, ask them. The worst case scenario, they will not answer. But I think that networking today, because of the social networks, is much easier. Follow them, communicate with them. When you share my tweet, I get interest in you. I look at the people who share my tweet because this is part of my work. So I take care. Sometimes if the person is interesting, I start following him. And it doesn't matter what he does in life, whether he's a student or a lawyer. Because I have an interest. We have a joint interest now. So
Mr. Meerts, what is your advice for young professionals? How to get into this area?
Well, I think, first of all, good schooling and to be active in universities, etc. And I'm training diplomats myself, not only in Israel, but also in Armenia, Russia, and so on. And so what you try to do is to raise their interest in different topics. And then they will come back to you and they will ask you, can you help us? We want to write something about this. Do you have certain specialists we can talk to, etc., etc. Sometimes Turkish diplomats who turn to me because they had to flee Turkey, and they said, well, we had your lessons in Ankara and now we are out of Turkey because the government thinks we are Gilonists, we are not. But anyway, can you help us to go to university, have not only bachelor but also master? So you try to help the people, but it's not much more than a drop in the ocean. May I just take the opportunity to say one thing about the honesty question, that honesty is so important in diplomacy. I think it is a typical Dutch cultural answer about honesty, which also means being blunt to us. So Mr. Dijsselbloem has been very honest about what he thinks
could
about
lead
the
to problems
Mediterranean
as well.
and that was not very diplomatic, and it backfired.
But I think it's if I may say this, a common denominator between the two countries, Israel and the Netherlands. Do you agree, Mr. Gilon?
Yes, very much so. We are different, by the way, because our cultures are different. We do it in different ways. We try to be nicer when we criticize people, to sugarcoat the criticism. You are not trying to sugarcoat, I think, the Dutch.
Exactly.
So there is a difference in the way, but we are both very direct and very flat societies. So Israel is also a very flat society. And if you are, you're a big shot and you don't speak to people under you in the right way, it will backfire at you. Yeah. It's the same thing.
Okay, we've come to the end of this webinar, but let's go to the main thing that you, Mr. Meerts and Mr. Gilon, want people to take with them out of this webinar. What is the one thing, maybe in one sentence, that you would say, if they have learned this or take this with them, I'm happy? Mr. Meerts?
If you want to be a diplomat, you have to be firm but flexible.
Great. Mr. Gilon?
At the end of the day, diplomacy is connections between people. It's all about connections between people.
Wow. So we're at the end of our webinar. We will post this later on YouTube. A special thanks to both my guests, Mr. Meerts and Mr. Gilon. I think I've learned a lot. Thanks for the answers you gave. I do have a better understanding about how diplomacy, especially in The Hague, works, I think. For all the people who joined, Thank you so much. And we hope to see you after our summer break. Follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook in order to know when we'll start again. That's it for now. So keep asking questions because you'll never know if you never ask. So thanks again and bye for now.